Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are diving into a topic that can be a real headache for renters, especially here in California: no-fault evictions.
Oh, yeah, those are tricky.
We've got a ton of sources to sift through today: legal guides, articles, even some personal stories.
I'm ready to dig in.
And our mission today is to really untangle this whole no-fault eviction thing, give our listeners the knowledge they need to navigate this system.
Because knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely, especially when it comes to something as important as your home.
Right, and it gets even more complicated because there's this new law coming in April 2024, SB 567, which changes the rules around no-fault evictions.
So that's going to be a big part of our deep dive today, making sure everyone's up to speed on those changes.
For sure. I think a lot of people are going to be surprised by what this new law means for them.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of SB 567, let's start with the basics. What exactly is a no-fault eviction? Can you break that down for us?
Definitely. So unlike evictions where a tenant's done something wrong, like not paying rent or damaging the property.
The classic lease violation.
Exactly. A no-fault eviction means a landlord can remove a tenant even if they haven't violated the lease agreement at all.
So even if you're the perfect tenant, you can still be shown the door.
Sadly, yes. And our sources highlight some pretty common reasons for these types of evictions. Things like the landlord wanting to move in themselves.
Oh, right. That's a big one.
Or wanting to do a major renovation, gut the whole place and jack up the rent.
Oh, yeah, the classic reno-eviction.
Or even deciding to just demolish the building entirely. Those are all considered valid reasons for a no-fault eviction in California.
Wow, so even if I'm doing everything right, my landlord could decide to turn my building into, I don't know, luxury condos, and I'd be out of luck.
That's the reality, yeah. But to be fair, California does have some safeguards in place to protect tenants.
Okay, good, because that sounds a little one-sided so far.
Right. So one of the key things is that California has this just cause standard for most evictions.
Just cause meaning?
Meaning the landlord needs a valid, legally recognized reason to evict someone. This is actually part of the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, or AB 1482.
AB 1482, got it. So that sounds like a win for tenants. But if that's the case, how do these no-fault evictions even exist under this just cause rule?
Well, that's where things get a little tricky. The Tenant Protection Act does a lot to protect tenants, but it doesn't completely eliminate no-fault evictions.
So there are still some loopholes.
Exactly. There are specific situations, like the ones we mentioned earlier, owner move-in, substantial remodels, demolition, where landlords are still allowed to evict without the tenant being at fault.
Okay, so it's like California law is trying to walk this tightrope between the rights of landlords and tenants.
It's a delicate balance for sure, and honestly, it's a balance that a lot of people feel is tipped too far in favor of landlords.
Yeah, especially when you consider the huge impact an eviction can have on a person's life.
Right. Uprooting your whole life, finding a new place to live in this crazy housing market, it's incredibly disruptive.
Not to mention the financial strain, moving costs, potentially having to leave your community.
It's a lot, and it's why this new law, SB 567, is so significant.
Right, so that's where things get really interesting. This law, which kicks in on April 1st, 2024, is going to change the rules of the game when it comes to no-fault evictions, especially those related to substantial remodels and owner move-in.
And it's about time. A lot of people felt like the old rules were way too loose, giving landlords too much leeway to, let's say, get creative with their justifications for evictions.
So SB 567 is all about closing those loopholes, making things a bit more fair for tenants.
That's the goal, yes. And I think it's got the potential to be a real game changer for renters in California.
Okay, I'm hooked. Let's unpack those changes. First up, substantial remodel evictions. What's the deal with how SB 567 impacts those?
All right, so landlords can still evict tenants for major renovations, but this new law brings in some pretty big changes. One of the biggest is the level of detail required in that termination notice that the tenant gets.
So we're talking about that official notice the landlord has to give you, saying they're evicting you.
Exactly. Before SB 567, that notice could be pretty vague. Landlords could just say substantial remodel and leave it at that.
So tenants were left in the dark about what was actually going on.
Totally, and that made it really hard to know if the eviction was legitimate or if the landlord was just trying to find a way to get rid of them.
So what kind of details are landlords now required to provide in that notice?
Well, for starters, they have to give a much more detailed description of the renovation work they're planning to do. Not just remodel, but like what specific changes are they making? What rooms are being affected? What kind of permits do they have?
So it's about transparency, making sure the tenant knows exactly what's happening.
Right, and it goes even further. They also have to provide information about the tenant's right to potentially move back into the unit after the remodel's done.
Oh, interesting. So tenants might actually have the option to return to their homes?
In some cases, yes. And the landlord has to explain that right clearly in the notice. And they also have to give tenants instructions on how to let them know if they want to move back in.
So it's not just about informing tenants about the remodel. It's about giving them a potential path back to their homes.
Exactly. Before SB 567, there was a lot of concern that landlords could use this substantial remodel thing as an excuse to evict tenants, do some minor cosmetic work.
Like a fresh coat of paint and call it a day.
Yeah, exactly. And then re-rent the unit at a much higher price. So requiring these detailed plans, permits, and all that, it helps prevent that kind of abuse.
So it's about holding landlords accountable, making sure they're not just using this as a sneaky way to raise rents.
Exactly. And it also gives tenants more power to push back if they think something's fishy. Like if the landlord claims they're doing a substantial remodel, but the plans only show minor changes, the tenant can now challenge that.
Okay, so SB 567 is definitely putting some teeth into these substantial remodel evictions.
Yeah.
But what about owner move-in evictions? How does this new law shake things up there?
All right, so this is where SB 567 gets really interesting because it tackles some of the biggest gray areas that were causing problems. One of the biggest issues was the whole question of who actually qualifies as an owner for the purpose of these evictions.
Oh yeah, I can imagine that was a bit of a loophole, right?
Totally. Under the old rules, it wasn't always clear who could use this type of eviction, so you'd have landlords using distant relatives, maybe even just friends.
As their excuse to get a tenant out.
Yeah, basically. So SB 567 tries to clean that up by very specifically defining who can use this type of eviction. It lays out that owners who hold properties as individuals, in family trusts, and in certain cases through partnerships or LLCs can all qualify.
So it's not just anyone who happens to be buddies with the landlord who can be used as the reason for an eviction.
Nope, it's much more specific now. And to make sure landlords aren't abusing this, SB 567 doesn't stop there. It also puts in these pretty strict residency requirements, meaning the owner or their family member can't just say they're moving in, they actually have to do it. And they have to live there for at least 12 months.
So no more using it as a temporary excuse to boot a tenant out.
Right. They got to actually move in within 90 days of the tenant leaving and stay there for a year. It's about making sure they're using this eviction for its intended purpose.
So they're really tying the landlord's hands here, making sure they're not just using this as a way to, free up a unit and then rent it to someone else at a higher price.
Exactly. It's about preventing those bait and switch tactics that some landlords were using.
That makes a lot of sense. But what if a landlord does try to game the system? Are there actual consequences for not following these new rules?
That's a big part of what makes SB 567 different. It brings in the idea of penalties for landlords who don't play by the rules.
Oh, it's not just a slap on the wrist anymore. There are real consequences for landlords who try to pull a fast one.
Yeah. Before SB 567, tenants often felt kind of helpless when they got hit with a no-fault eviction, even if they thought the landlord wasn't being totally honest about their reasons. There just weren't any real penalties, so landlords could take risks without worrying too much.
So this is a huge shift then, having actual consequences for landlords who violate the law. What kind of penalties are we talking about here? Could this actually be a game changer for tenants facing these situations?
It very well could be. I mean, before SB 567, it was all kind of a gamble for landlords. Now, there are real risks involved if they don't follow the rules. The penalties can range from fines to having to pay for the tenant's relocation expenses, and in some cases, the eviction could even be completely thrown out.
Wow, so landlords could actually be forced to let the tenants stay.
If they don't follow the rules, yes, it's a huge shift in power dynamics for sure.
It sounds like SB 567 is really trying to level the playing field. But even with these changes, no-fault evictions are still allowed in California.
Right. It's not a total ban on no-fault evictions. It's more about adding protections for tenants, making sure those evictions are happening for legitimate reasons.
So if you're a renter in California, what are your rights when it comes to evictions? Like, what are the things you absolutely need to know?
The biggest thing to remember is that even in a no-fault situation, you still have rights.
That's a good point.
Oh.
It's easy to feel powerless when you get that eviction notice, like you don't have any options.
Right. But that's not true. California has all these tenant protection laws, both at the state and local level, so it's important to know what those laws are and how they apply to your situation.
So it's not just about knowing the statewide rules, but also checking what my city or county has in place.
Exactly, because local ordinances can sometimes give you even more protections than state law does.
Okay, so it's worth doing your research and finding out what applies where you live.
Absolutely. But regardless of where you are in California, there are some basic tenant rights that apply everywhere. Like, you have the right to proper written notice before an eviction can happen.
So the landlord can't just show up and say, get out.
Nope. They have to give you that official notice with the right amount of time and all the legal stuff. You also have the right to fight improper or retaliatory evictions.
Retaliatory meaning.
Like, if you complain about a repair issue and the landlord tries to evict you to get back at you for speaking up, that's illegal in California.
So tenants have a right to speak up about issues without fear of retaliation.
Right. And you also have the right to respond to a lawsuit if a landlord takes you to court. You don't just have to roll over and accept the eviction.
So knowing these rights and how to exercise them, that feels absolutely crucial.
It is. It's your home. You have a right to defend it.
Totally. But I imagine this is where things can get really overwhelming for people. You get this legal notice, it's full of jargon, you're already stressed about the situation, and you just don't know what to do.
Oh, for sure. It can be really intimidating.
So let's break it down into practical steps. What should someone actually do if they get hit with a no-fault eviction notice?
First of all, don't panic.
Yeah.
But also, don't just ignore it and hope it goes away.
So no burying your head in the sand.
Right. You gotta act fast, because time is really important in these situations. The sooner you take action, the more options you'll have.
So what's the very first move someone should make?
The most important thing is to talk to a tenant rights lawyer or a legal aid clinic, like as soon as possible.
Okay, so get legal advice right away.
Yeah, they can help you figure out your rights, see if the eviction notice is even legal, and guide you through what to do next.
So they can kind of decode all the legal stuff and make sure you're not getting taken advantage of.
Exactly. Having that legal expertise on your side can make a world of difference, especially if it ends up going to court.
And you mentioned checking if the eviction notice is even legal. What does that involve?
It means really looking over the notice, like with a fine-tooth comb.
To make sure the landlord's following all the rules.
Exactly. You want to see if it gives a valid reason for the eviction, if it offers the correct amount of notice, if it includes all the information that SB 567 requires, like details about a substantial remodel or the owner moving in.
So it's about scrutinizing the notice, looking for any inconsistencies or missing information that could give you some leverage.
Yeah, exactly. Landlords might try to cut corners or intimidate tenants, especially if they think the tenant doesn't know their rights. So any little mistake on that notice could be grounds for challenging the eviction.
Interesting. So it's like playing detective.
Kind of, yeah. It's about making sure the landlord is following all the rules, dotting their I's and crossing their T's.
Okay, so we've got talk to a lawyer and scrutinize the notice is our first two action items. What else should tenants be thinking about?
Another thing to consider is trying to negotiate with the landlord. I know it can feel scary, but a lot of times landlords are willing to work things out.
So it's worth trying to have a conversation, see if you can reach some kind of agreement.
Exactly. You could ask for more time to move out or ask for help with relocation expenses.
Or if the eviction's for a substantial remodel, maybe even see if you can stay in the unit under a new agreement.
Yeah, all of that's on the table. You never know what you might be able to work out unless you try.
That's a good point. The worst they can say is no, right?
Exactly. And you might be surprised by what they're willing to do. But of course, sometimes negotiations break down and the eviction seems like it's really going to happen.
So what do you do then?
If that happens, it's time to shift gears and start gathering evidence to support your case. Things like copies of your rent receipts, maintenance requests, any emails or texts with the landlord, anything that shows you've been a good tenant.
So it's about building that paper trail, proving that you've been holding up your end of the bargain.
Exactly. Because if it ends up going to court, that kind of documentation can be really helpful.
And having a lawyer by your side through all of this can make a huge difference, right?
Oh, absolutely. They can help you figure out what evidence is important and how to use it effectively.
So even if you don't end up going to court, having that legal guidance can be super valuable.
For sure, it can give you peace of mind, knowing that you're doing everything you can to protect yourself.
And speaking of protecting yourself, facing an eviction can be super stressful, even if it's a no-fault situation.
Oh, yeah, it can be incredibly stressful and emotionally draining. It's your home, you know? It's where you feel safe and secure, and having that disrupted can be really tough.
Absolutely. So for our listeners who might be feeling overwhelmed by all of this, what are some resources that are out there to help them through this process?
Well, the good news is you don't have to go through this alone. There are all sorts of organizations out there that are dedicated to helping tenants facing eviction.
Like what kind of organizations? Can you give us some examples?
Sure, there are legal aid clinics that offer free or low-cost legal advice and representation.
So if you can't afford a lawyer, there are options available.
Exactly. And there are also tenant rights lawyers who specialize in these types of cases. A lot of them offer free consultations, and they really know the ins and outs of California eviction law.
So they can really advocate for you and make sure your rights are being protected.
Exactly. And then there are also tenant advocacy groups, which can provide support and referrals to legal assistance.
So they can kind of point you in the right direction, connect you with the resources you need.
Yeah, and they often have websites and hotlines with tons of information about tenant rights, the eviction process, all that stuff.
It sounds like there's a whole network of support out there for tenants facing eviction.
There is, and it's important to know that you're not alone in this. There are people who want to help.
That's really reassuring to hear. But how can tenants find these organizations? Are there any central hubs that list all these resources?
Yeah, for sure. Online resources for tenant rights information in California are a great place to start. Websites like the California Courts website and the California Department of Consumer Affairs have a ton of information on tenant rights and the eviction process.
So those are good starting points.
Definitely. And they often have directories of legal aid organizations and tenant advocacy groups across the state.
Okay, so you can find resources specific to your area.
Yeah, and don't forget to check with your local rent control board, too. They can give you info on local protections and resources in your city or county.
So it's worth checking out all those avenues.
Definitely. Remember, knowledge is power. And in these situations, having allies on your side is crucial.
This has been incredibly helpful. I'm sure our listeners are feeling a lot more informed and empowered now. But before we wrap up, is there anything else you think is really important for them to remember about no-fault evictions in California?
Yeah, one last thought. We've been focusing on California law this whole time, but it's important to remember that the specific rules can vary a lot from city to city and county to county.
Oh, right, like some places have rent control and others don't.
Exactly, so don't assume that state law is the only thing you need to worry about. Take some time to research what your local city or county has in place.
So you might actually have even stronger protections than you realized.
Exactly. It's always worth digging a little deeper and finding out what applies to you specifically.
That's a great point. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into no-fault evictions in California. I hope everyone listening feels a little more prepared and a lot less intimidated by this whole process.
Me too. It's a complex topic, but knowing your rights and having the right resources can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. And remember, even if you get hit with a no-fault eviction notice, it's not the end of the world. There are steps you can take and people who can help.
If you're in Southern California, specifically Orange County, Riverside, San Diego, or Los Angeles, a good place to start is the Martinez Law Center.
I was just going to mention them.
Yeah.
They specialize in representing tenants, not landlords, so you know they're on your side.
Yeah, and they handle all sorts of issues related to evictions, unlawful detainers, and tenant rights.
So if you're facing a tricky landlord-tenant situation, definitely check them out. You can find them online at martinezlawcenter.com.
They're a great resource, really knowledgeable and experienced.
Well, that brings our deep dive to a close. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.
It can really make a difference knowing what your local laws are.
Totally. So it's not just about knowing the broad strokes, it's about getting into those specifics.
Exactly.
It's like you got to zoom out to get the big picture, but then you got to zoom back in and focus on those local details.
Yeah, a good analogy.
So I'm curious, before we wrap up here, is there anything else you would suggest that tenants can do to kind of be proactive? Like what steps can you take to protect yourself before you get hit with an eviction notice?
That's a great question because a lot of times these no-fault evictions can feel like they come out of the blue.
It's like, bam, you get that notice and your world's turned upside down.
Right. So being prepared is key. And one of the simplest things you can do is really familiarize yourself with your lease agreement.
So make sure you actually read that thing, not just shove it in a drawer.
Exactly. Take the time to really understand your rights and responsibilities as a tenant. what the landlord can and can't do.
Because sometimes those lease agreements can be written in, like ancient legalese.
Oh, for sure, full of jargon. So if anything's unclear, don't be afraid to ask for clarification.
You can even have a lawyer look it over for you, just to make sure everything's above board.
That's a good idea. And along with knowing your lease, it's also smart to research the tenant protection laws in your city and county.
So not just the state laws, but also what's happening locally.
Right, because like we were saying before, local ordinances can sometimes give you even more protection than state law.
So it's like having an extra layer of defense.
Exactly. And then on a practical level, stay organized. Keep really good records of everything.
Like a paper trail.
Yeah, hold on to copies of your rent receipts, any communication with your landlord, documentation about repairs, anything like that.
So if you ever need to prove that you've been a responsible tenant, you've got the evidence.
Exactly. That kind of documentation can be really helpful, especially if you're facing an eviction.
Makes sense. Any other tips for being proactive?
Yeah, connect with local tenant organizations. Those groups are a great resource. They have newsletters, workshops, online forums.
So it's a way to stay informed, learn about your rights, and meet other renters in your area.
Exactly. It's all about building that network of support and staying up to date on what's happening with tenant law.
So to sum it all up, knowledge is power.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
The more you know about your rights as a tenant, the better prepared you'll be if you ever face an eviction.
Definitely.
This deep dive has been incredibly informative. I feel like I've learned so much today.
Me too.
And I'm sure our listeners are feeling a lot more empowered now, knowing that they have options and that they don't have to go through this alone.
I hope so.
So as we wrap up here, any final words of wisdom for our listeners out there who might be dealing with this whole no-fault eviction situation?
I would just say, don't be afraid to stand up for your rights. It can be intimidating, but you have a right to stay in your home, and there are resources out there to help you fight for that right.
That's a great point. Don't let yourself be bullied or intimidated. Know your rights, and don't be afraid to assert them.
Exactly.
Well, that brings our deep dive to a close. Thanks for listening, everyone, and I hope you found this information helpful.
And I want to add, if you're in Southern California specifically, Orange County, Riverside, San Diego, or Los Angeles, the Martinez Law Center is a great resource for tenants facing eviction.
They specialize in representing tenants, not landlords, so you know they're on your side.
Right, and they handle all sorts of tenant-related issues, not just evictions.
So definitely check them out. You can find them online at martinezlawcenter.com.
They offer free consultations, so it's worth reaching out to them if you need help.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for listening, everyone. Stay informed, stay empowered, and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.
Call now 714-442-9741. Thank you.